All right, great. My name is Mark Sullivan. I'm a senior writer at Fast Company magazine, and I am based in San Francisco, do a lot of reporting in Silicon Valley. It's been exciting the last few days. But I tell you that because the panel that we're doing now, I think we're going to kind of go over some of the same subjects, perhaps, that you've heard throughout the day, but we're going to hear about it from, the tech builders side of this. And I got interested in this about 18 months ago when I wrote a feature about how Silicon Valley is interacting with defense and intelligence, and really learned a lot about some of the friction points and barriers and problems that exist and that a lot of smart people are working on now. And so what I'm hoping to learn today is how that's all going and where we're at in 2023. Andrew, could I get you to introduce yourself and tell everybody what you do at Shield?
Sure. Andrew Dimitric, I'm the Chief Operating Officer at Shield AI.
And your product?
Our product, we've got a variety of products. First and foremost, HiveMind, which is our AI pilot. We also have the Nova system, which is a small autonomous quadcopter that can fly in GPS-denied environments for indoor exploration. We also have a VBAT, which is a Group 3 UAS. It takes off sort of like a SpaceX rocket, and the HiveMind technology unifies all of our AI products.
Cool, thanks. Matt, can you do that?
Sure. Matt Steckman, Chief Revenue Officer at Anduril Industries. We build essentially 3 buckets of things. All-domain sensing and force protection technology. We're U.S. SOCOM's counter-UAS program of record. We built a couple of unmanned platforms, some aerial stuff, and most recently some autonomous underwater vehicles. Just inked an interesting relationship and partnership with the Australian government. Might be worth chatting about a little bit as a case study for an interesting and fast way to do business. And then we build a couple of software platforms that underpin all of that hardware tech for autonomous command and control and mission autonomy. So particularly heterogeneous fleets of unmanned systems.
Cool, Shannon.
And hi, I'm Shannon Clark. Hopefully my microphone is working. And I am our Senior Vice President for R&D. I've been at Palantir for about 11 years now. We are a data integration company at its core, but we like to say that we're working with some of the world's largest organizations and governments working on their hardest data challenges and really making sense of that data. So I spend the majority of my time focused on our defense work. I started at the company working a lot of our SOCOM work, and that's expanded into a lot more of our AI work and just anywhere where we're forward deployed in the United States and we can help our warfighters.
So is part of your job interpreting demand signals?
Absolutely. And we love to do that in the field and not necessarily sitting here in DC with the professionals that are helping putting those requirements together. But I think one of the special things that we've been able to do really over the last almost 2 decades is forward deploy, is be with users, is really do that, test, fix, test again, in the field to learn approach. And we only are able to do that when we get to sit down with users and kind of understand their hardest problems. That's where we like to see the demand come from.
Yeah. So I'm going to kind of angle back to that first question. I mean, from the builder side or the seller side, when we're kind of talking about these friction points and just the ease at which tech companies deal with things like the DoD and the intelligence community, what can you tell me about what you've seen on that demand side over the last year or two that you think are promising signs, things that have erased friction points instead of put them up? I'll start with you.
So I would say that for small, scrappy startups like we were 5 or 6 years ago, I think the environment is significantly better. I think that the opportunities to enter the defense space are definitely there. I think that the barriers to entry have come down quite a bit. I think there's still, and the compliance cost has come down probably a touch for those smaller companies. I would say that for larger commercial tech companies, it's been a little bit more challenging, largely because, and this is something that came up in the report, I think, a few times, is that a lot of the dollars, and dollars really drive everything, are still tied up in these big legacy systems. And so that makes it challenging for those larger commercial companies to get involved. Of course, the cost of compliance is still very much there. And so if you take together the dollars for, I think, innovative commercial tech, together with the compliance load, it doesn't create a huge draw of commercial tech. And so that's been one of the challenges that we've been trying to overcome and work with our government partners on, is finding those pools of money in non-legacy systems that sort of strike at the heart of innovation and for such things like autonomy.
Well, the compliance part of that is always going to be there, isn't it?
Yes, it is. But it's, you look at, like, again, going back to, like, in our early days, the fact that there were OTAs available that really lessened the compliance cost was huge. Mm-hmm. And I think a big part of the reason we're here today is because that opened up as an avenue, contracting avenue.
Can you give us your perspective on that, Matt?
Yeah, I mean, certainly agree with Andrew for the most part. I think we have done a lot over the last 10, 20 years. I think Palantir was leading the way on this to figure out entrances into the department. I don't think that that's the problem anymore. I think that you're seeing a lot of sort of top-level rhetoric around increasing scale, increasing production, and predictability within the purchasing cycle. Mm-hmm. So I've been thinking a lot about this from the perspective of startups like ours. Well, not a startup anymore, pardon me. I was at Palantir a long time ago, so in my head it's still a startup. And so I think that the important part about this conversation is realizing that an exit for our types of companies are multi-billion-dollar in scale. That's why our investors work with us, and that's what they expect. And so if you get into the department with a one-time deal for $1 million, that's great. But in the long run, the only thing that matters is over $100 million in recurring revenue that you can count on every single year. And part of the reason for that is our types of businesses tend to be structured differently than the defense primes. So the defense primes basically don't have to care about profit margin. I mean, it's kind of like heretical to say, but they get their high single-digit operating margin every year, and they just want to build the top line in order to build the aggregate amount of profit that's available to them. And the reason they can do that is they don't have to invest a lot of their own money back into their businesses for innovation, because they get the government to pay for that innovation through the large R&D budget that, again, is now in question, I think, from a lot of the top leadership in the department, which I think is exactly the right direction to move. So for our businesses, we need to understand production level scale. We need to understand predictability. We need enough information from our government partners such that we're able to predict where things will go. And then that allows us to go raise way, way, way more R&D capital than the government could ever provide any company to invest in these problems. But because there is no ability right now to forecast or predict, it's very hard for me, as an example, as a chief revenue officer, to unlock 10, 20, 50 million in CapEx to build out the necessary capability to then fund the thing that I know the government is going to buy. And so that cycle is broken right now between profit and reinvestment, because it's never had to exist in the defense world. I guess the important thing to realize is it now has to exist if we want to bring in new companies into the department. It's the only way it's going to work.
And I do think it's getting better. And harking back to, like, if we look at 10 years ago, when that was at Palantir, and we would go, as Palantir is the scrappy startup, and we would walk into a room and we would respond to a solicitation, and we were so excited. We had this great demo. We were going to show how our product worked. And we would be up against folks that would have, large primes that would have a 100-page, PowerPoint presentation, and they would show what they could build in 5 years. And we thought naively, well, we have this thing that will work today. And we would lose time after time out, because I think that, they trusted that those large companies knew what they were doing. And even though maybe what they had wasn't available today, that they would have that in 5 years, because they do have these large R&D budgets. And it was really frustrating and disappointing for us. But I think what we've shown, and I even remember this very critical demo we did, I think it was actually with CBP, who said, we're going to give you some data and we're going to ask you to come back in a few days and show us what you can do with that data. And it was like they weren't going to accept a PowerPoint presentation for that. And we came back and we showed, and that was what won the day, because they actually saw that this is a real thing that users can have, that we can field in a month and not in 5 years. And we are seeing more acquisition processes go that way. I think when you look at some of the large Army acquisition projects right now, some of the ones that we're involved in, Titan is a good example, it's do demos, down select to a few vendors, send those vendors out in the field, have them work with users, as I mentioned before, and really refine those requirements in a way that's not done in a room with an acquisitions officer just checking the box to say. And I don't say that in disservice to the acquisition officer. I say that because it's so important for us to see what breaks in the field and not what breaks in a lab or what breaks according to a PowerPoint presentation. So my hope is that we continue to move in that direction more, especially when we're looking at software acquisitions.
So there's actually two layers of this. I mean, we've talked about how to facilitate or push this idea of a head-to-head challenge,
Yeah.
instead of just requirements or specifications or
Yeah.
what have you. But there's another layer. You don't do that in a boardroom. You do that in the field, right?
Which I think any one of us here would say, bring it on.
Yeah.
That excites us, right? That's what excites our engineers. Not, let me sit here and build the best PowerPoint presentation, but how does this actually work?
Yeah. I mean, it's a nice idea. I guess the question, though, is that how compelling is it versus the sort of muscle memory on the buy side that has done it the other way for so long?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a challenge, but it's one that I think that the DoD is overcoming, and we're seeing more and more examples of it. I remember in our early days when we started demoing the Nova capability that we built, there were a lot of people thought that sort of capability was 10 years out, but we could actually show it in real physical form. And I remember a lot of jaws dropping when they saw that. And I think those, getting it down to real operational capabilities, getting it into the hands of the warfighter quickly, and then iterating upon that is really where we need to go. And the good news is, we are seeing more of it. I'd like to see more of it still. But.
Yeah.
There's definitely more of it happening. I would say one thing to fix is if a non-traditional does win one of these competitive in the field, down select, I think these are all the right things to do, and it should just become the de facto way that the department buys stuff. I think there's some important pieces, though, if a non-traditional does win, where the government can't then expect sort of immediate scale. They can expect a ramp. And there's ways that you can cover that ramp in the short term. But what we've seen, which penalizes non-traditionals, is these things are almost structured in such a way where, literally RFPs are written where you can interpret it as, if you have never done this before, thou shalt never do it for us. Right? It's and it'll say that in 87 different requirements that you have to piece together. But that's basically what it says. And so I think there's a piece here, particularly when it comes to easy things, just like building a factory, right? It's there's a lot of RFPs written that assumes you already have a factory. And that's unfortunate because you're cutting off a massive part of the market that can capitalize very quickly to create the constructs needed to build these things. Manufacturing is a known process within the commercial industry, right? And so I think the winner of the competition that builds the net new thing that is being added to the capability and to the fight, that ultimately wins that contract, you should trust that those companies can then capitalize to build the not net new stuff, right? The factories and the manufacturing, the production, and the supply chain. I think these things are shaped in such a way where it's almost inaccessible if, again, you've never done them before.
So you're saying that they should understand or make allowances for the fact that, or they should have confidence in companies like yours that you can go out and activate that supply chain and the manufacturing?
100%, yeah. So specifically, the recommendation is test the things in the field that are net new, right? And that's the thing you should care about. Test the hard technology and the piece that's actually innovative. And then let the company build everything else, whether through subcontracts or directly. But we get wrapped around the axle a lot around oh, well, you've never built 100 of this, so how could you ever build 100 of something? Well, if you never let me try, how am I ever going to prove it to you? But that's not the net new part, right? The net new part is being able to fly multiple things at once with no people touching it, or you know, God knows what, right, that we're talking about here. That's the hard stuff that we need to get after.
Yeah, yeah. Any thoughts about that?
No, I mean, I think that they've said it all. But I also think this is why it's really interesting now to see the government move towards allowing some software companies to be primes. And I think there's a good example of this in our partnership with some of those folks on the stage as we work on that with some of the, on Titan in particular with the Army. You know, I don't think that that was something that anyone would have 10 years ago would have said, oh, we will let a software company do this, but it's really interesting now because there's components of Titan that are hardware that we're never, I don't think, some of the people on my team would love to say they're going to go build a satellite or go build a truck, but that's not going to happen anytime soon. So at least not that I've heard. But I think I think there is a leap of faith there, and I think it's going really well so far. So I'm hoping that it's kind of a lesson to be learned to allow this in the future or have the proclivity to do this more in the future.
Before we talk about successes, are there any other parts or friction points that should be mentioned here that kind of, I mean, I'm sure there's probably a list
You
of
said
them.
you didn't want this to be a gripe session, so we're trying to
That's
stay
right,
positive.
I did say
No,
that. Yeah. Okay, let's pick a different question.
No, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. I think there's positive outlooks to all of that. I'm just teasing.
All right. Well, yeah, I guess I'm just trying to kind of thoroughly cover this question about friction points.
Yeah.
And get to, you know, if we've just talked about one part of it, but, you know, there is this report card and there's a part of it that.
Yeah, maybe
doesn't look
we'll
so
just
good.
add new stuff that probably hasn't had a ton of ink already spilled on it. Like one example is value-based pricing. Like, it's impossible. And the only way to get to an A/B comparison is through competition. And I'm not sure if the community has fully embraced that reality, where tech moves so fast, companies are going to make different types of offers in different ways. And ultimately, the government, if they actually follow these and heed these recommendations, will test them in the field. So you'll know what they do, and you'll see the capability, you'll see the outcome. Then you can get to an A/B comparison, and then you can see what they cost. The pricing in that can only be solved through a competitive market where you have multiple bidders. Very, very difficult to price software or price these novel things that you invest hundreds of millions in order to sell your first unit. I mean, you're just like throwing a dart at that point. So the only thing that can actually solve it is pricing, and I'm not quite sure if we figured out how to do that quite yet.
Yeah. I have to ask about the Valley of Death. You know, your three companies are pretty well capitalized companies, so I'm not sure if you're the greatest example of this, but you know, that's one of the first things that people told me about when I kind of opened up this subject. Is this picture of there's a lot of little technology companies out there that might have great products, great technology. You know, maybe some of them are trying to be dual use companies, but you know, is it still a real possibility that if they're trying to rely on government contracts that they just won't make it across?
Yeah, I think, what did Alex Moore say? Was it like $1 billion or something like that? You know, a few minutes ago, and obviously he's very familiar at 8VC with, you know, how much capital is needed. And I think a lot of times when you hear Peter Thiel or others talk about successful companies, and he names Palantir and SpaceX, and you look at the people that are behind those companies, you know, you can come to the same conclusion you just made. I think what we see is that we at Palantir want to pay it forward to those companies. I think a lot of what we're doing right now is partnering with some of these small AI companies to bring them into the fold and to help them give them some more stability about what it looks like a year or two from now as being part of a program of record that we're on, because we know what it was like to go to the board and have to tell them, like, well, we got this small pilot, it's only $1 million, we hope that it turns into something. But like back in the room, we're like, crap, we got a lot of work to do to make this, you know, into something successful, or to make this part of a program of record. So I actually think it's almost like a corporate responsibility of ours to help some of these companies. And like I said, give them some more stability as they're going through this process, because it's hard for them. I mean, I don't envy them having to go to their boards and explain, well, we won this SIBR, okay, well, what does this mean for you next year? They may not know the answer to that. So that's one thing that we're doing to try and kind of be, I think, a good partner to other, small companies that are going through that process right now.
Yeah, I would certainly advocate for, so we've opened the door really wide for entrance into the community. I would advocate for a shrinking to the things you know will actually transition. I actually think you will counterintuitively get more investment into companies if companies can show that in a very fast amount of time they're able to transition. So in a weird way, opening the door so wide has caused so many kind of false starts that investors get cold. And there might be room to start to think about, like, should we actually require that before you open a door to a new program or new pilot or new effort, you already have a transition path established so that that company knows if they succeed, they can kind of walk that path together with the government. And to the point of forecastability, that company can forecast that and then go collect more checks from investors. Thank you to investors in the room, by the way. We love your checks. But they can go collect the capital needed to then get to that next forecasted milestone. But all of these doors open that result in a $250,000 SIBR, and then the company kind of quits after 2 years. That has a freezing effect on the community. That's the exact opposite of what the door opening is trying to do in the first place.
I think somebody told me about this idea of being able to get to a no quickly for companies that aren't ready, just like end their pain, and get onto the companies that can actually do it. And then put money behind those companies.
Yeah, in a lot of ways, you'd probably be saving them a lot of time and frustration, being kind of more frontal and more honest with that. And I could see that. I mean, there are a lot of companies. I remember someone telling me once when I was in Tampa, like, once a system gets put on the system, it never really gets taken off. It might kind of die a slow death and it's there, but it never gets taken off. And I didn't really believe them, and then I saw that unfold over the next 10 years where I was like, but no one's using that. Yeah, but we still have the licenses because maybe there's 1 or 2 people in the back room. But I think that's very true. But like I said, I mean, I do think it's getting better. I feel like I'm hearing less of that frustration recently. So I want to say that that's a good sign. I don't know actually what is making that determination or why it's getting better, but I like that I hear less of it, because I feel like there was a period 2 years ago, almost pre-COVID, where it's like every company I talked to, they were like, well, we just won this SIBR, and I didn't really know what to make of that, and I don't think they did either. So hopefully we're seeing some changes that are helping those companies.
The only thing I would add here, and I think this is somewhat obvious, but there's a reason these 3 companies are up here, because we had access to great private capital. Mm-hmm. That's what allowed us to sort of span that. If you don't have that, that's a big problem. I think that the interest within the VC community in defense tech has really changed things. I think the public-private partnership needs to focus on that. That's how you bridge that gap. But I agree with everything that Matt just said, that perhaps we went a bit too broad, but like focus and bridge. And I think that's the way that we're going to get out of this, and then you'll see much more of Shields, Andurils, Palantirs, et cetera.
Mm-hmm. Just want to be really clear on this point. I heard the gentleman in the previous panel say that over the last year, this space has the thinking is that this is a good business to be in, and it's a good business for VCs to be in. I want to make sure I understand what is causing that sort of temperature shift. Maybe I better ask him.
I was like,
Yeah, there's a lot of reasons.
Yeah.
I'm not sure it's a good business to be in, to be honest with you. It's kind of crazy to start a defense-focused startup, period. Yeah. I mean, the number of hurdles, the number of barriers, the number of monopolies in the market. I mean, it's bananas. The fact that investors are in on this is probably mostly to do with geopolitics.
I don't understand.
Well, I think the world now realizes there are bad guys again.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that was an okay awakening to, I think, to everybody, but definitely to the technical community. And so you're seeing that spark interest. My fear is a lot of companies get capitalized, and a lot of companies fail, and the business cycle ends. And so the government and the department need to do a lot to actually treasure this moment in time, and figure out how to have at least a couple of successes that the private capital community can look at to say, this is the mark and this is why we're going to stay in the game and this is why we're in it for the long term.
Yeah, yeah, interesting. So I did want to get to the sort of the success stories part of this, and it finally. But you know, all three of your companies have great products, and one thing that I heard when I was originally researching this is that if you want to get into this kind of business, you have to design a wonderful product that makes sense, but you also have to design an approach to doing sort of the process within the buyer. One great tactic is having a champion within the buyer who's going to carry the torch for you. Are there other things that you've learned just about working with the federal government that kind of have smoothed your way to, you know, getting a timely decision at least on your product?
I think you're right. Having a champion is absolutely important. I don't think any of us have created a solution that I would say was easily understandable or interpretable at first shot, you know, meeting with someone. Because the three of us have all been part of companies that have built something novel. And so, you know, our approach to everything from what we built to the approach that we took. So I actually don't think that any of us built anything that was consumable or building towards the buyer either. In fact, it took a lot of sweat and tears and work to actually convince someone why what we were building made sense and why it was better.
Yeah, I see.
So with each friction point, I think, or with the success stories, definitely has come a lot of friction. You know, I think about working on, you know, something a few years ago where we had, you know, the most senior person, you know, in the branch saying that I need this, but it still took 2 years to be able to get a solicitation and be able to, and to go through the competitive process and to win that. And if it's like a 4-star general is saying, I need this today for, you know, the readiness and the health of my people, but it still takes 2 years to go through that. There's success in that it finally happened, but it doesn't, the timeline for that is really long, right? So I think, like I said, with each success, it's still, there's a lot of risk on the part of all of us still, which thankfully, like, you know, I think we have enough funding, each of us now, to keep going, but it's still taking a long time.
Well said. Yeah, there's a lot of discussion always around like, can we build a system that doesn't depend on champions? And I'm like, actually just the opposite. I actually think we need to build a system that identifies champions and lifts them very quickly in their organizations to positions of influence and power. That's just me. What a novel and crazy idea to bet on our smart people to continue to do smart things. You know, I would say the only other advice I give every startup that I work with or meet is to shoot big. So, you know, I would much rather take 10 gigantic swings every year than 100 tiny swings. And the reason for that is systemically within the government, the focus put on those big, important, meaningful muscle movements means that you're operating at such a level where you will find more champions to break down a lot of those barriers for you and to work with you as partners. And you'll find that there is counterintuitively less friction in the more complicated, larger programs than in the sort of smaller day-to-day acquisition cycle.
I don't know that I have that much more to add, but I would say that, you know, early on at Shield, we had some tremendous champions, which was great, but we quickly realized that just simply wasn't enough. There needed to be a lot of champions. And so thinking holistically across the whole system, finding those, you know, those key decision makers and stakeholders, some of them senior, some of them not so senior, but most importantly, understanding the money and how the money flows and trying to get smart on that very, very early. That's what we figured out very, very early, and I think that's, you know, where you know, some of our success came from, is that, wow, the importance of money in this whole system. And not just, so if some, you know, very senior, you know, SES or a general says, I want that capability, well, if there's not money behind it, it's just not going to, you know, materialize. And so that's the sort of best, you know, approach I could say to an early startup is like, you know, start to understand the system quickly, but don't anchor on any one champion. Build a a team of champions across the different key segments of what you've got to knock out.
So when that one powerful person says, yeah, we need that, is the problem that nobody's written down and or sat down and typed up the requirements that describe the thing that that person wants? Does that have to happen before anything moves?
Yes, I actually think it does. There's lots of things that happen here, but I would just say, first and foremost, the acquisition system is incredibly complex, and there are many, many, many different parts that have to move in unison to make it happen. And so one person saying, let's do this, it's just not enough. You have to crack the entire system, and you have to, well, anyway, that's basically it. And the other thing, of course, is that, when a very senior person says we have to have this, I think that person has many, many different priorities. And so unless you have this general momentum within the system, championing your product across all the different parts of it, it's just not going to hold. You need to build that critical momentum and keep pushing it. I remember early on we said, in order to make a sale happen, you've got to pick it up and run with it yourself and make it happen. Create the easy button every step of the way from all the different people, because that's how you get things done. So that's why I think that one single person is never going to be enough. You have to have a team.
And I think it needs to come from bottom up too, because even if you have a champion that's the most senior person that says, I want this, and you need to go in the field and use this tomorrow, 9 out of 10 times a soldier or an airman or Marine will say, I don't want this, you just gave this to me, this wasn't what I was asking for. And so if you don't have a top-down approach of a champion at a senior level, but also the users and the groundswell that are saying we want this, it doesn't really matter. I think we saw this a lot, especially in our early work at SOCOM, which I think more than anything, why we are still there 12 years later when we started as a bridge solution, just the smallest tiny IRAD money that we got from an office in the Pentagon, and why we're still there today is because we've spent so much time with those folks and the users in the field, and they have been the groundswell that even when, an acquisition arm has said, maybe we want to go with someone else, they've said, no, this is what we need today, this is helping us save lives. And so having that groundswell at the bottom has been, to me, equally as important as opposed to just having, the top-down approach. Because, it's almost like anything in life where someone tells you you have to use something, and if it's not what you like, you just, like I said, it kind of ends up in the corner, and someone says that it's still on the system, but no one's using it. So that's been something that I think has been really important for us.
Yeah, interesting. I really enjoyed Secretary LaPlante's comments earlier today, and one thing that I wrote down that he said is, he was talking about this same thing, about kind of working with technology companies and working on innovation centers, and he says, help us think about manufacturing tech products, help us think about how to develop software. Do you feel heard by him and his organization? Are there dialogues of this kind going on between people in the tech community and people in defense?
Wow, that question feels like a trap, doesn't it?
I was like, Matt, you can go first.
Yeah. Nose goes. I'll take a swing at it. Why not? Right? Yeah. Absolutely. The communication has increased a ton. There's a software acquisition path. There's all sorts of interesting stuff taking place. I would say the one thing that we still feel dissonance on, well, there's a lot of things, but if I were to point, again, I want to point out new stuff that hasn't probably been talked about all day, there is an order of magnitude difference between the expectation for the government of what software costs and what it actually costs. So literally an order of magnitude. So you'll go in and you'll say, sir, what do you think this takes to build? And they'll go, 10 people and $10 million, right? And the actual answer is probably more like 500 people and $150 million. And so order of magnitude differences, you can't kind of get there through conversation, right? That's a hard dissonance to figure out. This often sort of centers on platforms and architecture. So the commercial sector has figured out the platform and architecture game. And they pour, billions and billions and billions a year into sometimes a platform that literally does nothing. It just enables someone else to do something. And they make money off of it, right? And so until we figure out like the dissonance in the order of magnitude math between how the government thinks about costs for these things and what they actually cost, if we were to look at it from a commercial provider perspective, we're always going to not be able to actually meet in the middle on a plan that makes sense.
Yeah, and that's a really good point, because I think this is particularly true with software. With hardware, if you said, we're going to go build the next gen fighter, and you said, and you came to the table and you said, how much is this going to cost? Someone would say, that seems really expensive, but you know what? I don't know how to build that here, so I bet you're right, and they're willing to take that risk. When you say, and Matt's analogy was a good one, you know, how much is this going to cost? How many people is it going to take? The thought then seems to be, well, I can just probably build this myself, and I can save a lot of money doing it. And if we've seen time after time all the failed programs, in particular software programs, where the mentality has been, I'm going to build this in-house, it's going to cost less, I'm going to get it done. And you look, and 5-10 years later, the thing is still not working, and you look at how much money has been spent. It's sad, because you could have done it faster, you could have done it with something that's available today, and you could have done it for a lot less money. Because what they think of how much it costs is, while it's still more expensive what it really costs, they actually end up exceeding what it would really cost to pay a commercial company to do that. And I think there's just dozens of examples throughout the government where we've seen this happen.
Yeah. Matt, I'm interested in what you said about platforms, because this is such a common thing that's kind of Microsoft's business, Salesforce. I wonder if there's, is that the way defense needs to be thinking about new technology more? I mean, sort of in that frame, as a platform that enables other stuff, and everything has to integrate in some way.
Yeah, I think that the change here and the reason why platforms are important are you have to now keep up with the pacing threat, which is China, which means that no technology is ever done. And so if you follow it to its logical conclusion, what you actually get to from a technologist perspective is the only thing that matters is velocity against the problem. It's how fast I can get new builds, new capability, whether that's software, whether that's hardware, into the field as fast as I possibly can, based on new threat intelligence coming in that then causes you to iterate and cycle. In the commercial industry, right, your velocity is determined by the generalized platforms and computing platforms you've created, so that you don't have to solve the same problem over and over and over again, so that when a new thing happens in the commercial industry, you've already got around 80% of the solution and the tooling and the infrastructure you need to just click everything new on and off you go. There is a parallel in defense that needs to be thought through, and I think this applies to platforms. I also think it applies to acquisitions, right? The acquisition framework has to allow for this thing never being done, and for O&M to actually be constant development, integration, and fielding of new kit and new software. And so it's very hard to measure, but I would generally tend to think about these things as, can I measure the vendors competing for my thing against their ability and their velocity to tackle new problems with that same core platform?
Okay. I want to get to Q&A, because I have a feeling there's good questions. Does anybody have a question for one or all of our panelists? No questions. All right, I was wrong. Bang. Yes.
Software as a service within DoD's
Hello, Glenn McCartan, DIU. Software as a service is really hard for a lot of our acquisition community to really kind of embrace. Can you give some anecdotes, experiences about how you've convinced or kind of made the case why software as a service is important for DoD? Even though it's intuitive in the commercial sector, I imagine DoD, they're still very, very skeptical. I'd love to hear some opinions on that.
Yeah, I know you were going to look at me first. I was going to allow one of you. Yeah, what do I think about this? How I want to approach this?
I always have things to say.
Yeah.
I think, yes, it has been a challenge. I remember sort of early in our life, this is actually just when I joined, we approached one of our customers in the SOCOM community and broached the topic of having our AI sold more as a service and less as like you just take the whole thing. the whole thing, and it caused an uproar. They were not interested in it at all, and so we pivoted very quickly and packaged it up and gave it to them. I think that is evolving and it's getting better, and I think this concept of software as a service is moving along in some of our efforts. I still think, though, it's something that's hard for folks to wrap their head around. I think the acquisition system is largely built around, acquiring big, exquisite hardware systems, and that's how people think. And then when they think about software as a service, it's like, well, that's another world, and that's over here. And when you start to combine those two worlds, they get very unsettled, because it's like, I'm buying this big, expensive thing. Surely I should be able to just run it independently forever. The fact that I'm going to continue paying your money is like, it doesn't fit with our framework. However, the reality is that O&M money is out there, and you have to maintain those products, and usually have an existing relationship with the OEM. And so why is software as a service such a problem? But as I said, it's a conundrum, but it's one that I think has had a lot of thought around it, and I think it is getting better. But ultimately, especially with things like autonomy, hive mind, lattice, etc., these are things that I think they're going to be crucial enablers as we move forward in the future with all the geopolitical threats such as China and the pace of threat, because they're going to be doing it for sure. So I think we've got to make it happen.
I think when we compete on projects that have been like legacy systems and where they're looking to upgrade, I think that's a large part of it, is how do you change the mindset that you're not going to just deliver something one day and then there's going to be this O&M tail, and you're not going to continue to do iteration, and you're not going to continue to provide that service. And I remember sitting, I won't say the customer, one day, and they asked me, like, well, when do you stop doing upgrades? So like, when will that be it? And I asked them, like, do you have an iPhone or Android? Like, do you not download the latest update when you get that? And I think they didn't. I think they wanted to say that they didn't, because they didn't want to answer, like, me to prove the point that, like, would you just sit there and watch your iPhone, iOS update come in and not take that upgrade? And it's like shocking to me that some people still think that way. But again, I think this goes back a little bit to the cost and understanding what the cost of software is, and understanding the cost of hardware, and people still not being able to grapple with the fact that software is so important. And if you look at what's going on in the Ukraine right now, it's not just about ammo. It's not just about munitions. It's about software, and it's about what those folks are doing, and some of the great work that some of the folks on the stage are a part of. A lot of it is about software, and so the investment in that is critical for national security. And so the investment, and you want to keep paying for that. You want to continue to see updates here, and if you didn't, it's putting our national security at risk, right? So I think, again, like, there's been friction in that in the past, but it is one place that I think we're seeing more and more progress. I don't think we're entirely there yet, but we probably never will be on the scale. But my hope is that as more legacy systems kind of start to age, and as more companies start to produce really valuable software, that there'll be a better likening to this, and people will be more comfortable with it in the future.
In the back?
Matt McHenry, DIU. Both the government and the commercial sector spend tremendous amounts of money on R&D every year. A lot of these are focused on the same technology sectors. Does the panel have any recommendations on how we could better integrate those efforts?
Yeah, so I think that the commercial sector, for the most part, has become obviously the leader in taking tech and then like productizing it, hardening it, making it more reliable, design for manufacturing, things like that. There is absolutely still room in government for research on new and hard things that don't have a capital market. I generally think, though, that the R&D budgets have bled way too far into items that definitely have a capital market, that the commercial sector can and will provide solutions for. And so to me, it's getting that balance correct, right? The place for government is where the economy can't solve for it on its own. And there's a lot of things where that is correct and true. But what's that Venn diagram, and what is the government investing in where actually the capital market should just solve the problem? And there's probably a bit of analysis and understanding to do there.
Anybody else have a question? I did want to get to one thing. We started on Ukraine a little bit, and other than the software as a service part of this, how has the conflict there changed the conversations that you're having? Has the attitude changed on the person that's sitting across the table from you, and has it changed within your own companies? I mean, given that all of the products that you sell are very relevant in that conflict.
Yeah, I mean, we're very vocal about our support. Our CEO, I think, was like one of the first CEOs from a tech company to go to Ukraine. And I think actually what I've seen a lot of, and I appreciate a lot of, is the fact that people in the government have appreciated our outspoken support, because sometimes it's actually incredible to see that not everyone does want to show their support. And so personally, I'm proud of that fact. I think it's opened up a lot of doors, not just actually with the government, but with other companies too. There's a lot of work that we've done in the last year with different partnerships with different companies together, other like-minded companies, to figure out what we can do to partner to field some of the best technology there. So I think the conversation hasn't just changed on the public and private side, but actually on the private to private side of seeing more integration and kind of reliance on just some of those private partnerships to bring forth the best technology. But I think there's a deep appreciation for any company by the U.S. government and by our allies, quite frankly, in companies that are willing to stand up and say that they are offering their support. So that's, I think, one of the most heartfelt things that I've seen personally over the last year.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's interesting too from an acquisition perspective, so, a lot of times people say, oh, the FAR, it's impossible to move fast, and it's actually not. It gives you all of the tools you need to move fast if you desire to do so. And so what we've seen in our business on the hardware side is now all of these things, right, that the FAR and acquisition regulation allow you to do, but are hidden in the deep, dark recesses of these tomes of acquisition books, they're all being unlocked, right? And now we're all moving fast, we're iterating, we mentioned sort of as a service and platform work. Every company that's deployed there is probably on their 7th version of their product because of everything you're learning in the day-to-day fight. Wow. And all of these tools, they exist, right? And so I think what we're seeing is in real time case studies for how to do fast acquisitions and how to get things into the field fast that actually work.
Great.
The only other thing I guess I would add for us, I think it's really helped, highlight a lot of cost asymmetries on the battlefield, which is really important for us in the world of autonomy and unmanned systems. You've seen, things like Stinger missiles and Javelins, costing a couple $100K, taking out multi-million-dollar systems, and that just is not sustainable. But that's the future. That's where it's going to go. And so the way to defeat that is to say you can, take, say, one of these exquisite, complex, very expensive systems, make them, take that money, spend it on, say, a swarm of drones that are fully autonomous. You're not losing the pilot either, and then all of a sudden the cost asymmetries really change overnight, and you're able to push capability onto the battlefield much faster and much more effectively than we're seeing folks like the Russians do. And so it's really, I think it's opening a lot of people's eyes to this new world. And then additionally, what you're also seeing is some non-traditional countries like Turkey and I guess on the Russian side, Iran, start to push some of their technology forward into the battlefield, and it's actually showing to be very effective. And so what I think we're going to see is a spreading of this sort of lower cost, unmanned, autonomous systems going out and driving a lot of impact, which is really going to change things. And so I think it's absolutely changed the narrative in this space.
Yeah. Yeah, using these high-priced weapons like the Javelin, I think you mentioned, as a way of dealing with drones and really low-cost things. Is that what you were talking about?
Less that. It's more like let's say a Stinger used to shoot down a very expensive attack helicopter, or a Javelin to blow up a main battle tank.
Okay.
I mean, that's the cost asymmetries are wild. What's just happened there, but that's reality. I mean, I used to be an attack helicopter pilot in the Marine Corps, and I would be terrified to fly in the Ukraine right now because of all the Stingers out there. I don't think I would be relevant on the battlefield, frankly. And so, but what would be relevant is 500 autonomous drones flying around. You would just change everything. And so you create that awareness and you create that projection of capability. And I think that's the direction that ultimately we have to go, because that's the direction the world is going. We need to be ahead of it.
Well, I certainly hope we're learning well enough and fast enough from what's going on there. Unfortunately, we're out of time here. So really appreciate this. I sure learned a lot from you guys. And would you guys please give them a round of applause?